I discovered my therapist was recording our sessions for her true crime podcast about my father's murder. The whole thing started when I was mindlessly scrolling through Spotify, looking for something to listen to during my morning jog. I had been seeing my therapist for almost 8 months, working through the trauma of losing my father in what the police called a home invasion gone wrong. The sessions had been helping, or so I thought, until I stumbled across a podcast called Behind Closed Doors, Real Case Files, and saw my therapist's name listed as the host. My hands literally started shaking as I clicked on the most recent episode. The description made my blood run cold. Today we dive deep into the unsolved murder of a local businessman, using exclusive insights from his daughter's therapy sessions. I couldn't believe what I was reading. My father's case had been plastered all over the local news for months, but this felt different, more personal, more invasive. I pressed play with trembling fingers and heard her voice, the same calm, professional tone she used during our sessions, but now she was talking about my father's death like it was entertainment. She described details about our conversations, things I had shared in confidence about finding his body, about the blood on the kitchen floor, about how I couldn't sleep for weeks afterward. She had changed my name, but anyone who knew me would recognize the story immediately. The worst part was how she painted herself as some kind of detective, theorizing about who might have killed him based on what I had told her about his business dealings and personal relationships. She even suggested that maybe I knew more than I was letting on, that perhaps there were family secrets I was hiding. I felt sick to my stomach, listening to her turn my grief into content for her stupid podcast. I spent the next few hours listening to earlier episodes, discovering that she had been doing this for over a year with multiple clients. She had a whole series about different cases, all supposedly based on real therapeutic insights from people dealing with trauma. The comments section was full of people praising her for her unique perspective and inside access to the minds of crime victims. My entire world felt like it was crumbling. The person I had trusted with my most vulnerable moments, the professional I had paid to help me heal, had been exploiting my pain for profit and fame. I couldn't stop thinking about all the intimate details I had shared with her, wondering which ones would end up in her next episode. The betrayal cut deeper than I expected, bringing back all the feelings of violation I had experienced after my father's murder. I had finally started to feel safe again, to trust someone with my emotions, and now that safety had been ripped away. I couldn't eat or sleep, and I found myself constantly checking her podcast to see if she had uploaded any new episodes about my case. But then I found out she had been messaging my father's business partner on Instagram, asking for more details about their relationship. I discovered this completely by accident when my father's former business partner reached out to me on social media. He sent me a screenshot of messages he had received from someone claiming to be researching a podcast about unsolved crimes. The messages were clearly from my therapist, though she was using a fake name and profile picture. She had been asking him invasive questions about my father's business practices, his personal life, and even about me. The messages were manipulative and sneaky, with her pretending to be a legitimate journalist working on a story that would help solve my father's case. She had asked him about my father's financial situation, whether he had any enemies, and if there were any family disputes that might have led to his death. She even asked if I had seemed suspicious, or if I had acted strangely after the murder. What made it worse was that she had been doing this for months, apparently starting her investigation shortly after I became her client. She had been using information from our sessions to craft targeted questions for people in my father's life, essentially turning my therapy into a tool for her amateur detective work. She wasn't just exploiting my trauma for content. She was actively investigating my family and friends without their consent. The business partner told me he had found the whole interaction strange and uncomfortable, especially since the person asking questions seemed to know intimate details about my father's personal life that hadn't been reported in the news. He had suspected something was off, but hadn't known how to reach me until he saw my name in a news article about victims' rights. I felt like such an idiot for not seeing the signs earlier. During our sessions, she had always seemed unusually interested in the details of my father's life, asking follow-up questions that seemed to go beyond what was necessary for my healing. She had encouraged me to talk about his business relationships, his friendships, even his romantic life after my mother's death years earlier. I had thought she was trying to help me process my grief, but now I realized she was mining me for information. The violation felt even deeper now, knowing that she hadn't just been passively recording our sessions, but actively using what I told her to contact people in my life. She had turned my therapy into her personal investigation, and I had been paying her for the privilege of being exploited. I started to wonder who else she might have contacted, what other aspects of my life she might have been investigating behind my back. The thought that she might have reached out to my friends, my coworkers, or even my extended family made me feel paranoid and exposed. I had trusted her with everything, and she had used that trust to turn my life into her entertainment. My anger was starting to build, replacing the initial shock and hurt with something much more focused and determined. I wasn't going to let her get away with this, but I needed to be smart about how I handled it. I started documenting everything, taking screenshots of her podcast episodes, saving the messages she had sent to my father's business partner, and gathering evidence of her unethical behavior. I also realized she had been secretly recording video during our sessions, not just audio. This discovery happened when I was going through her podcast website more carefully, looking for any mention of my case or my father's murder. I found a section called Premium Content that required a subscription to access. Something about it felt off, so I decided to pay the monthly fee to see what kind of additional content she was offering to her paying subscribers. What I found made me physically ill. She had been recording video of our sessions, not just audio, and she was selling access to edited footage of her clients' most vulnerable moments. The videos were heavily edited and had the faces blurred out, but she included enough identifying details that anyone who knew the cases would recognize the people involved. There was a video of me breaking down while talking about finding my father's body, with her voiceover analyzing my body language and facial expressions. She had turned my grief into a case study, dissecting my emotional reactions like I was some kind of specimen under a microscope. The video had dozens of comments from subscribers discussing whether I seemed genuine or if I was hiding something. I watched myself cry, shake, and struggle to get words out while she sat there pretending to be supportive, all while secretly recording everything to sell to strangers on the internet. She had captured me at my most vulnerable and turned it into entertainment for people who got off on true crime content. The comments were discussing my mental state, my relationship with my father, and whether I might have been involved in his death. The worst part was seeing how she had edited the footage to make me look more suspicious than I actually was. She had cut out parts where I was clearly grieving and left in moments where I was angry or confused, creating a narrative that suggested I might not be telling the whole truth about my father's death. She was literally manipulating evidence to support her theories about the case. I felt completely exposed and violated, knowing that strangers had been watching me cry and analyzing my every gesture and expression. The trust I had placed in her had been completely weaponized against me, and she had been profiting from my pain in ways I never could have imagined. I spent hours going through all the premium content, discovering that she had been doing this to multiple clients for years. She had built her entire brand around exploiting people's trauma, and I had been just another source of content for her to monetize. The subscriber count was in the thousands, meaning thousands of people had been watching my private therapy sessions without my knowledge or consent. The realization that I had been performing my grief for an audience I didn't know existed was devastating. Every genuine emotion, every breakthrough, every moment of vulnerability had been captured and sold to strangers who were consuming my pain as entertainment. I felt like I had been stripped naked and put on display without my consent. I started taking screenshots of everything, documenting the illegal recording, the unauthorized use of my sessions, and the way she had been selling access to footage of me without my permission. I knew I needed to take action, but I also knew I needed to be strategic about it. She had been doing this for years, which meant she probably had lawyers and knew how to protect herself legally. Then my mother called me crying because someone had contacted her claiming to be making a documentary about Dad's murder. My mother had been out of the picture for most of my adult life, but she had reached out after my father's death to offer her condolences and support. We had been slowly rebuilding our relationship, talking on the phone once a week, and trying to heal some of the old wounds from their divorce years earlier. So when she called me sobbing, I knew something was seriously wrong. She told me that someone had contacted her claiming to be a documentary filmmaker working on a project about unsolved murders in our area. The person had asked her detailed questions about her marriage to my father, their divorce, and whether she thought I might have had any reason to hurt him. The questions had been presented as part of a legitimate investigation that might help solve his case. My mother had been confused and upset by the call, especially since the person seemed to know intimate details about our family that hadn't been made public. They knew about the arguments my parents had during their divorce, about my father's business struggles, and even about my own relationship with him during my teenage years. She had felt pressured to answer the questions because the caller had convinced her it might help find his killer. When she described the voice and the types of questions that had been asked, I immediately knew it was my therapist. The woman had been using different personas and fake identities to contact people in my life, gathering information for her podcast and her supposed investigation. She had manipulated my grieving mother into revealing personal information about our family by pretending to be working on a legitimate project. The thought of my therapist cold calling my mother and manipulating her into sharing private information about our family made me angrier than anything else she had done. My mother was already fragile from my father's death and the guilt she carried about their divorce. She didn't need some podcaster pretending to be a filmmaker exploiting her grief for content. I tried to explain to my mother what was happening without making her feel worse about being manipulated. I told her about the podcast, about the recordings, about all the ways this woman had been exploiting our family's tragedy for her own gain. My mother was horrified and kept apologizing for giving away information, but I assured her that she had no way of knowing what was really happening. We talked for hours about what we should do next. My mother wanted to call the police immediately, but I wasn't sure if what my therapist was doing was technically illegal or just deeply unethical. I knew I needed to consult with a lawyer before making any moves, but I also knew that every day we waited was another day she could be exploiting other families. The conversation with my mother also made me realize how far-reaching my therapist's investigation had been. She hadn't just been passively recording our sessions. She had been actively researching my entire family, contacting people from my past, and building a comprehensive picture of our lives to use as content for her podcast. She had turned my father's murder into her personal project, and we had all been unknowing participants in her exploitation. I felt responsible for dragging my mother into this mess, even though I knew it wasn't really my fault. I had been seeking help for my trauma, and instead, I had inadvertently given someone access to my entire family's private information. The guilt was overwhelming, but it also fueled my determination to stop her from doing this to anyone else. That night, I made the decision to go public with what I had discovered. I wasn't going to let her continue exploiting grieving families for her entertainment empire. I started drafting social media posts, planning to expose her on every platform I could think of, and preparing to contact every single person who had been affected by her actions. But the next morning, I woke up to find that all evidence of her podcast had been completely scrubbed from the internet. I grabbed my phone as soon as I woke up, ready to continue documenting her podcast and building my case against her. But when I searched for behind closed doors, real case files, nothing came up. The Spotify page was gone, the website was down, and all the social media accounts associated with the podcast had been deleted or made private. At first, I thought maybe I had imagined the whole thing, that my grief had somehow made me paranoid and delusional. But then I remembered the screenshots I had taken, the evidence I had been gathering over the past few days. I frantically searched through my phone and found all the documentation I had saved, proving that the podcast had been real and that she had been exploiting my sessions. I tried searching for cached versions of her website, checking the Internet Archive, and looking for any trace of the podcast on other platforms. Everything had been systematically removed, like it had never existed at all. Even the premium content section, where she had been selling video footage of therapy sessions, had been completely wiped. The thoroughness of the deletion made me realize that she must have known I was onto her. Maybe she had been monitoring who was accessing her content, or maybe she had other ways of tracking when people were investigating her activities. Either way, she had moved quickly to cover her tracks and eliminate any evidence of what she had been doing. I felt a mix of relief and frustration. On one hand, the fact that she had deleted everything suggested that she knew what she was doing was wrong, and that she was scared of being caught. On the other hand, the deletion made it much harder for me to prove what had happened or to hold her accountable for her actions. I started calling other people who might have known about the podcast, trying to find anyone else who had listened to it or could corroborate my story. I reached out to my father's business partner, asking if he had listened to any of the episodes or if he had any evidence of her contacting him. He confirmed that he had listened to a few episodes and that he still had the screenshots of her messages. I also started researching her background more thoroughly, looking for any other complaints or issues that might have been filed against her. I found a few negative reviews from former clients who mentioned feeling like their privacy had been violated, but nothing as specific as what I had discovered. It seemed like she had been careful to cover her tracks, and that I might be the first person to figure out the full extent of what she was doing. The realization that she had been monitoring my activities and had moved to cover her tracks made me feel paranoid and unsafe. If she was willing to delete years of content to avoid being caught, what else might she be willing to do to protect herself? I started wondering if she might try to discredit me, or if she might contact my friends and family to try to control the narrative. I decided that I needed to move quickly before she could do any more damage. I started drafting a complaint to the state licensing board, detailing everything I had discovered and providing all the evidence I had gathered. I also reached out to a lawyer who specialized in privacy violations and professional misconduct, hoping to explore my legal options. But even as I was taking these steps, I couldn't shake the feeling that she was still out there, still exploiting other people's trauma and still profiting from other families' pain. The fact that she had been able to delete everything so quickly suggested that she had done this before, and that she had a system in place for covering her tracks when things got too risky. I kept thinking about all the other voices I had heard on her podcast, all the other people whose private therapy sessions had been turned into entertainment without their knowledge or consent. I wondered if any of them had figured out what was happening, or if I was the only one who had been smart enough or lucky enough to discover the truth. The weight of that responsibility was overwhelming, but it also gave me a sense of purpose that I hadn't felt since my father's death. I wasn't just fighting for myself anymore. I was fighting for everyone she had exploited and everyone she might exploit in the future. I wasn't going to let her get away with this, no matter how thoroughly she tried to cover her tracks. As I sat there with my phone in my hands, staring at the screenshots that were now my only proof of what had happened, I made a promise to myself and to my father's memory. I was going to expose her for what she was, even if it meant going up against someone who clearly had more resources and experience at hiding her crimes than I did. She had picked the wrong person to exploit, and I was going to make sure she paid for every moment of pain she had caused.